This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm delighted, a very special guest. Please take a look at this book, The Cantonment Conspiracy by General Manoj Naravane, former Chief of Army Staff of the Indian Army. The General has decided to write this brilliant thriller after he retired from active service. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I invited the General to have a conversation with me to talk about his book, this book, but also many other issues of India's security system. Thanks very much, sir, for joining me.
Thank you, Hindol. I'm glad to be in this conversation with you and on your platform, and I look forward to a stimulating conversation.
Thank you very much, sir, for your time. Really appreciate it. I want to begin then by talking about your book, sir. Tell me this process of writing. Instead of, many people in your position would have written a grand memoir, perhaps written about a conflict situation they have experienced firsthand. Why did you choose fiction?
Well, I have been writing off and on in the earlier part of my service. I had written a few short stories, fiction, plus of course I had contributed to professional articles to various journals. So it's not that fiction was something totally new. So the writing thing was always there, I guess, to tell a tale. And I feel that one should not restrict yourself in any manner. It's not that people in civil service or from the armed forces should only write about academic issues or non-fiction. But why not explore other genres? As I said in an earlier interview also, that just like an artist, he can do oil paintings, he can do watercolors. Within that, he can choose landscapes, portraits, stills. There is so much to explore. So why should you restrict yourself to just one form of writing, and therefore give different routes to your creativity? So it's with that in mind I said, let us try. As I said, I've been writing short stories. So short stories, let's write a full-fledged novel.
And of course, you prolifically write columns, General, and you've been writing them for a long time. I also want to ask you, your book, of course, is based, the protagonists of your book are, of course, young officers of the NDA who are being trained to become military personnel, and the experiences they go through. It's a thriller. They encounter an assault and murder, and they discover many things. Again, I don't want to give away the crux of the book.
Yeah.
But tell me, why did you choose this setting?
Well, when the thought came to write a work of fiction, in fact, I also give lectures at many places from time to time, wherever I'm invited. So I'd gone to a little town in UP, and they had put me up in their guest house, a civilian organization. And after dinner, when I was walking in the lawns of that guest house, and there was a little bit of breeze, a little clouds, a little moon. So that whole atmosphere, when I was taking my after dinner walk, that atmosphere suggested that it is a good location for a murder mystery. So the location sort of said murder mystery, and that's how I chose a murder mystery. So it was a little bit in a reverse direction. And the story which I mentioned about the officer mess,
Yes.
In the book, although the mess is of course in a different location, but the idea of that mess is drawn from that quaint little house I had stayed in. So that is how that idea that germinated.
Are you an avid reader of thrillers? Because it's very interesting to choose the thriller as the genre for your first fiction.
Yes, I have quite a wide range of reading. I've read everything from westerns to P.G. Wodehouse to Neville Shute, so the Arthur Haley, Wilbur Smith, you can go on and on with the name of authors. So yes, I've been fond of reading, And in the fiction genre, definitely thrillers, spy stories, John le Carre. So all that, I guess, is all in my subconscious, and I'm sure I would have drawn some small tidbits from here or there, perhaps unknowingly, and that must have come out somehow or the other in the book.
Talk to me a little bit about your writing process. There was, like I was saying, there was one thing to if you had written, say, your memoirs or a deeply studied work of, say, military strategy in India or something like this. But this is an entirely different ball game. Talk to me about how you set out writing this. What was your process like?
Yeah, so the broad plot was there in my mind that once when as I said, I was walking in the lawn, so that I said, let's make a murder mystery. So that broad plot that a murder takes place in that setting. But when you actually got down to writing, then I had to make a skeleton framework, the chapterization, broad. That this is how it starts. This is how the tempo and the tension builds up, and of course then the grand finale, how it has to come down. So just like any other work, I actually did make a timeline, line on a paper with intervals for each chapter, and above the line and below the line who are the characters on one side and what are the incidents on the other side, and how they have to get merged into every chapter. So there was a little theoretical process to it. It's not that you just sat down one day and started, it was a stormy night and finished the end. So
Right.
it did happen. So there was a little bit of groundwork.
Fair enough. I want to also talk to you a little bit about, funnily enough, when I first heard that you had written a book and got to know what was the name of the book, that was the day I was reading about this entire report that had come out in many places about another coup attempt or almost coup attempt in Bangladesh. And your book is called The Cantonment Conspiracy. So, the day I read it, I laughed in my head. But I thought when I interview you, I'll ask you this question. And I will now go into other matters that I want to talk to you about India's current, security situation. But I want to ask you this, General. It has often perplexed many people that while our two neighbors who were carved out from India, both Pakistan and Bangladesh, consistently have this sort of trouble in their militaries, which is rebellion, coups, attempt at coups. This kind of complete, sort of anarchical situation keeps turning up again and again in these militaries, which were also in a sense carved out of the broader Indian sort of military establishment. India has had a really honorable record of never ever facing such an issue. In fact, I remember one of the Pakistani generals on a visit joking to me that this can never happen in India, because in Pakistan all you need to do is the general has to call the Rawalpindi Corps commander and everything else is fixed. Whereas in India, if the Northern Command calls the Eastern Command, they might say we have a holiday. Southern Command might say there's something else going on, and so on and so forth. But that's of course in a lighter vein. But on a serious note, General, why do you think that we have had such a honorable exception, even though these sort of countries which were really carved out of our system really have gone the other route?
It's interesting that you mentioned Bangladesh and the title of the book. I don't recollect exactly now, but I think there was a cantonment conspiracy in Bangladesh.
Absolutely.
So, but of course that has nothing to do with this book. The title just chose itself. But yes, that's an interesting question, and one which is asked quite often in different fora of different people. I think the first is that we have always managed to keep ourselves totally professional and totally apolitical. And the credit for that goes both ways. Everything is always a two-way street. It is not one way. It is not only the services which have stayed apolitical, but I believe that to a large extent the political parties have also kept the army and the armed forces on a slightly higher pedestal and not really tried to draw them into that, the political arena. So, as I said, it's a two-way street, and both have respected each other's boundaries. I think that is a major start point. And second, of course, is that we swear, and each and every soldier, Jawan, officer on commission or enrollment takes the oath on to safeguard the Constitution of India. So, irrespective of your region, your language, whatever your political inclinations might be, that is all on one side. It is the Constitution of India which reigns supreme. So, I think these two factors combined have got us to where we are today, that we can be counted upon the armed. When I say army, it means Army, Navy, Air Force, the armed forces. The armed forces can be counted upon to deliver whenever the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, or any other security threat presents itself.
I also want to ask you, before I ask you some more technical questions, I want to ask you, because we're talking about, began by talking about a book and part of popular culture, I want to ask you, in the recent years, as India has sought to define itself more clearly, perhaps more assertively, we have seen a lot more interest in military history, in stories of military valor. I have journalist friends who have written great books about India's bravest. You may have seen some of these books too, which are about great feats by soldiers, and much more interest in victories that we have had in the military field, great characters. There was a great film that was made about Sam Bahadur, General Sam Bahadur, and many more. There was another one on Pippa, on a young tanker in a war. So tell me, why do you feel this sort of interest has emerged in popular society general at this juncture of our history?
In fact, some of the books you have mentioned, India's Brave Hearts, they're there at the back of my bookcase. So I think the armed forces have gained place in the collective consciousness of the nation, especially after the Kargil War, which was one of the first televised wars in India. Till then, everything was the reach of the media was not so much. Plus, the explosion of social media which has taken place. So all these things have brought the public much closer to the armed forces, and therefore the interest in the armed forces has also increased. And it is a good thing that that interest has increased. We should not shy away from, and when I say we, I mean the armed forces, the army. There was a time when we were always kept ourselves away from the general public and kept ourselves aloof, confined to our cantonments. That was okay for British times, when they needed to keep the army away from the population, and any kind of fraternization was actually frowned upon. But now we are India's army. We are not a colonial army. So if we are the people's army, as I said, we are of the people and for the people. Who are we defending after all? We are defending the people of India. We are not fighting for some ideological cause on the borders. So if we are fighting for the people of India, then the people should know what the Indian army is about and who constitute the army, the brave hearts, its commanders. So it is a very good thing that so many journalists and other authors have taken up this task to bring the country and its armed forces closer to each other.
We are talking in 2025, General. It is the major year which has been declared as a year of defense reforms. And I want to take you on that subject for a moment, sir. Could you please reflect upon what kind of reforms India is rolling out, including, of course, of theatre integration and various other structural reforms that are happening within the India's armed forces, And what are the challenges and opportunities these might be throwing up? Because the process doesn't seem to be easy.
Yes, in fact, I wrote an article on this, on the defense reforms, maybe 2-3 months back. One of the greatest challenges for any military the world over is to remain contemporary and current, especially in today's day when technological changes are taking place so fast that if you are not technologically abreast or maybe even slightly ahead of the curve, you are likely to fall so far behind that in a future conflict the enemy will outgun you. And for that we need to really, one of the challenges is how to speed up our defense acquisition process, which is quite complicated. The manual, the DAP 2020 was some 400 pages, the DAP 2025 became 600 pages. So are we complicating the process or are we trying to simplify it? So now it's again 2026, so it's the revision of the DAP is due again. So what we really need to do is to simplify this entire acquisition process so that from the time the need is felt, what we call the acceptance of necessity in our defense terminology, to the time the weapon is actually or the platform is actually inducted, should be as short as possible. You cannot have 10-year and 15-year acquisition periods, because if the acceptance of necessity, theoretically let us say, was granted in 2000 and after 15-20 years it has come in 2020. It has taken 15-20 years for that whole acquisition process to take place. Then what has come in 2020, based on your concept of 2000, is already 20 years too late, is already 20 years outdated. So that is why that timelines have to be compressed drastically. And that is one major challenge, and if that challenge is addressed and met by simplifying the procedures, then I think more than half the work would get done. And as Mr. Parekar, our former defense minister, had once said, the whole procedure and this manuals and all are made, it gives me the impression that it is made because you think everyone is a chore. That L1 system, who will open the tender, who will not, this guarantee, that, it's so many restrictive clauses and no scope of, any exemptions or, so that is what is making it so complicated. So we really need to address that issue to start with. But the opportunity part that you mentioned, especially with the Make in India and Atmanirbharta, the emphasis being given on that, the scope now for the civil industry to really jump into this field is really great. And the more the players, obviously the more the competition, the better product that the armed forces will receive. So we have always been encouraging civilian industry and even small startups, MSMEs, more and more of them to participate in this whole process, so that we get whatever the best the country has to offer. And we have that potential, we have that capability to provide our armed forces with the wherewithal which is required.
I was going to talk to you about the integration of the theatre commands, but since you mentioned in Atmanirbhar Bharat, I want to go there for a moment, if I may, sir. There's a lot of talk about rising volumes and rising, quantums of defense exports from India. But at the same time, on many critical issues, India's ability to produce indigenous weaponry still seems far away. For instance, from some of our main rivals, the example, of course, I'm thinking about is China, far less, of course, the United States. but China being the main issue, we are very far away in many departments in building indigenous technology and building indigenous armaments. And there doesn't seem to be a clear plan to catch up, sir. I accept that our defense exports are definitely going up, especially the BrahMos missile is a classic example of that, the exports of the BrahMos missile. But there does seem to be quite a wide gulf which seems very difficult to bridge. How do you see this? What can we do to bridge this gulf?
You see, Indol, for a long time, the defense procurement was restricted to a very few players, and they were mainly the defense PSUs. If at all something was going out to the civil industry, it was on the non-lethal side. Obviously, trucks were being given, say, by Tatas, but non-lethal equipment or clothing. So those were, but the industry was really never incorporated into that whole process, right from R&D onwards, and even before R&D, that what is the futuristic requirement going to be? What are the numbers that the army would look at? What is the weapon system and platform that is desired? What is the features? So the civil industry was really kept out of that loop for a long time. It is only over the last, say, decade and a half that they have been really brought into this loop. So obviously it is going to take them time to catch up, to understand the whole process. But now that they have come in, I think it will be a faster and faster catching up. Initially, of course, it looks very slow, but by geometric progression, I think they will very soon be able to produce world-class equipment, and we will not really have to look beyond our shores. You gave the example of BrahMos. That is, of course, a very good and a success story. Kalyani Systems have exported the ATAGs, the advanced towed artillery gun system, to other countries. So we are, catching up. But because this opportunity was not accorded to the civil industry, that is why this gap happened in the first place. But I'm very confident that they will, and it is in their interest also. It's again, if they put their minds to it, then there is a big slice of the defense pie, the capital acquisition pie, that they can also look forward to. So it will help them also to take part in this.
One of the big things that the Indian Armed Forces has done in the recent past is this long-awaited integration of theatre commands. Now, different people have different, ideas or opinions about how successful this process is turning out to be. Of course, there is a degree of success, of course, because there's been a degree of integration. But what are the modalities that are required to further integrate all of this, to really make it a unified command? All of this is consistently debated, and I wanted to know, what is your opinion? How do you see this progress? Because you served at the highest level, how did you see this progress? What more needs to be done? What has succeeded, and what perhaps more work is needed upon?
There is no denying the fact that integrated theatre commands are very much required, especially in today's battlefield milieu and the environment that we are likely to operate in the future, which is going to be very extremely complex and uncertain, where the decision-making loops are going to be smaller and smaller, and therefore the greater the integration at all levels, obviously the better. So it is a operational necessity which is driving the theatre commands. It is not just some whims and fancies or copying other countries or anything like that. So we must always keep in mind that whatever reform we undertake, at the bottom line must be, is it going to make you operationally more efficient? And if that is kept as the baseline, and whatever changes or organization structures are made, if that is kept as the baseline and kept in mind, then everything will flow smoothly. and there will be very little opposition to it. Now again, there are two ways to go about it. One is a top-down approach and one is a bottoms-up approach. You can make the entire organization say, okay, let's roll it out. The other way is to start small. The more easy functions which can be integrated across the three services, and then keep building up on that integration, and over a period of time you will have the required level of integration to be able to say that yes, you are an integrated theatre command. So both approaches are possible, but what needs to be understood is that it is over a period of time. It is not an on-off switch that today you are where you are today and tomorrow you are integrated theatre command. That whole process of rollout is going to take place perhaps over a decade. And I can also give this example that when China was transitioning, what I learnt as a student in higher command course, when I did the course, that this is what changes China is contemplating. Actually, then I was teaching that when I went back as an instructor in higher command 15 years later. So that is how long it takes even for structures and organizations to change, to evolve. They are tried out, a pilot test is done, and then it's not that 100% units can be changed overnight. There's a rollout plan for that, 1 per year, 2 per year. So that whole transition process also takes a long time. So it will happen the same way in India. So we should not be either thinking or saying that 3 years or 4 years have elapsed since the day the government said that we need to have integrated theatre commands and nothing has happened. It is not that nothing has happened. Things are happening, but perhaps the changes at the ground level are not really visible to all. But as I said, theatre commands will happen sooner or later.
Let's talk a little bit about the security situation as it unfolds in our country, General. Many people believe, especially when the when the imbroglio with China was ongoing, and some of that has obviously eased a little bit, but it's still quite precarious according to many people. But when it was at its peak, in a sense, and our eastern border also, Manipur and all these things began to flare up. Of course, there's a perpetual problem with Pakistan and the northern borders. This entire scenario of a two-front war, or even a 2.5-front war, seemed to have come alive for India. In a sense, one of India's worst nightmares. Even today, the eastern border is extremely precarious. In Bangladesh, a new administration, not very conducive to India, has come about, which already has BNS Sheikh Hasina built with Chinese money, where they're docking submarines. Of course, with China, situation is unclear. Pakistan, what's happening in Balochistan, Northwest Frontier Province, how that will explode, we don't know. When you look at this entire scenario, General, as somebody who served at the highest level, how precarious is our situation? Or how do you assess India's sovereignty issues and our security situation at this point in time?
Well, first, if you take the larger picture, we have our neighbours, and they're free to choose their way of life. In fact, India as a country, foreign policy is based on two major pillars. One is that we have no extraterritorial ambitions, and the second is that we don't impose our will on others. It is not our way or the highway. So countries are free to choose their way of life, who they want to be friends with. I'm sure they would also always be doing whatever they're doing with the best interests of their countries and their people in mind. And just as we are friends with the US, we are friends with Russia. So there's nothing wrong with that. So if we can also have good relations with two countries, why not others? So I don't think we should have to see this as a zero-sum game. You can always have whatever your foreign policy and your relations can always be broad-based, depending on what your interests are. But coming closer home, as far as our security scenario is concerned, I always say that we use this we must understand the multi-front threat that we have, and which is distinct from fighting on multiple fronts. We'll use both that two-front threat and two-front war very interchangeably, but they are very distinct from each other. So obviously we have multiple front threats. We have our threat from the east, from the west. We could be having a maritime threat. We have our internal security threat, the half front we talk about. So yes, we have threats on multiple fronts, and we are cognizant that we need to prepare for each of them, and how we prepare, the wherewithal that we need, the way we need to equip ourselves, our tactics, our strategy for each threat would be different. But to actually fight a war, wage a war on multiple fronts is not a good idea. And more often than not, and historically, countries which have waged two-front wars have always been on the receiving end. The example of Israel is given that they fought on multiple fronts but emerged victorious, but there were different reasons for that. But the prime example of fighting on two fronts and losing is Germany, where before they subdued their western border, they launched Barbarossa on Russia, and then of course they got squeezed from both sides. So fighting on two fronts is not a good idea. But yes, we have threats on multiple fronts, and we need to be cognizant of those threats. And I'm sure that all threats are not equally high at all times. Yes? So even when during the 71 war, for example, to neutralize the China threat, we signed an agreement with Russia. So we made one front quiet, one threat quiet, and fought only one front war, although it was in the western front and the eastern front, but against one country. So I'm sure as we go ahead, in case we are faced with such a potentially hazardous situation, the country, the polity, the diplomats, everyone will make sure that the armed forces are not placed in such a disadvantageous situation that they're looking in three different directions at the same time. And which brings me to that point that wars are not fought by armies, wars are fought by nations. So when it comes to that level that we have to go to war, and the country is to go to war, all people will have put their wheel to the shoulder, and as I said, the diplomatic initiatives would have been taken. The pressure would be brought to bear. When will our friends come in handy? And that is why we cultivate friends all over the world. So when all that is done, I'm sure that we will not be put in this disadvantageous position of having to fight on two fronts at any given time.
There are all kinds of emerging scenarios, General. People now talk about grey zone warfare, hybrid warfare. There is also, especially after the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, there's an entire scenario of, swarm drone attacks and so on and so forth. These are all emerging ways of warfare. How prepared is India to deal with these kinds of new emerging pathways of conflict?
I think we are well abreast and seized of the situation and what was happening all over the world, whether there are big battles between, say, Russia and Ukraine, or smaller, skirmishes wherever in the world. The lessons are being continuously drawn from that, and especially the advent of drones and the large-scale use of drones in various facets of warfare, from surveillance to actual kamikaze attacks, the whole range. So all these are obviously always on our radar. We keep looking at these developments and where we are and where we need to be. So that is part of the long-term perspective plan on how to keep modernizing ourselves. But I think that in the overall scheme of things, we are quite abreast and not lagging behind in any field, whether it is in cyber warfare or advanced technologies. We are right there at the front line.
I want to talk to you a little bit about, to take this conversation about technology forward. We are now in an age where you're talking about quantum warfare. We're talking about artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, and so on and so forth. There has also already been one incident where it is largely believed that there was a blackout in the city of Mumbai, which had been rolled out by hackers, perhaps of Chinese origin. So these are all new unfolding dimensions. How much integration of technology during your time and of course now and even before your time is the Indian Armed Forces doing to counter such scenarios?
Well, cyber warfare is one thing we should understand, that we might be under a cyber threat or attack even today, but it is not seen. You can penetrate into networks, you can find out how to penetrate them, you can find out how to actually disable those networks and then exit that network without leaving a trace. So that may be happening even today, and incidents which have happened either of blackouts or some signaling systems not working for some time, they could well be genuine failures of technology or could be the handiwork of cyber attacks. So that is why we as a country and as individuals too need to be very aware of this potent cyber threat and be suspicious of any such untoward activity which is happening. As it could even be in your bank account. So it is not that only the services are targeted, it is overall systems. The stock exchange can be targeted, the power grids, the railway signaling system. So many things can be targeted which can bring any country to a halt. In fact, a couple of days ago there was an article in the paper that in some meeting in Europe, the Chinese have more or less admitted that they did carry out some kind of cyber penetration or attacks on US infrastructure networks. So that is always on. But as I said, again, we are seized of this problem. We have a defense cyber agency at the under the headquarter IDS. Each of the services have their own cyber setup for defensive cyber security. We are not getting into the offensive cyber security part, that is not in our charter. So, and this aspect of how to maintain our systems in the event of a cyber attack and the countermeasures of that is very much part of our entire training process, and I would not like to say more about that for obvious reasons.
I want to ask you, General, with the global order unfolding and breaking up in a sense, at least we are definitely in a whole new world. The old so-called rules-based order or liberal order seems to be, it was fraying for a long time. Now it seems to be collapsing. We're certainly in a new world of competition. Now, in this competition, one vital part, perhaps not discussed enough in India, is emerging further heightened nuclear competition. Once again, nuclear weapons competition has started to grow quite rapidly. Now there are questions being asked on how strong India's second strike capability really is. That's number one. And number two, people like Bharat Karnad and others argue that India should really now look at perhaps developing a thermonuclear a weapon of some kind, a megaton bomb, and so on and so forth. I wonder what you think about this. What is your analysis of where we stand as far as the nuclear question is concerned today?
Well, I think we have a quite a robust nuclear program, and we have, as you said, even first and second strike capabilities with the induction of more and more nuclear submarines, our entire triad, land, air, and sea-based systems would be complete, which will also give us those retaliatory capabilities, and those, of course, will have to be built up, and it is happening slowly and steadily. Once again, I would like to say that because many of these things are not in the public domain, sometimes the impression is there that we are not technologically abreast, or we are not giving enough attention to the nuclear aspect or things like that. But some of these things are best kept little hidden, so that it comes as a surprise to everyone, including the enemy. So which is the most important part. But I think we are good with it, and we have a nuclear policy. We have a stated policy of no first use. But if there are changes the world over, after all, policies are made by us, and if required, policies can be changed also. There is not written stone, and if need be, that can be changed or modified. So this is all an evolving process, and our counter-strike capabilities, I think, quite robust.
Again, so because you mentioned this, I must ask you, some people also believe that India's nuclear doctrine itself, including no first use policy and so on and so forth, needs a sort of, revamp for the future, futuristic revamp, so to speak. Do you believe that's true, or do you believe, as some others do, that no, what we have at the moment as doctrine is absolutely fine, no further contemplation on this at this juncture is required? Or are you part of the bunch of people who perhaps feels that perhaps it's an evolving thing, and we should always continuously, as the world changes around us, continuously look at this doctrine to see whether it's future ready, so to speak?
I think I just mentioned that all doctrines are it's an evolving process, and nothing is constant. As the world changes, as the factors change, our policies and doctrines will also have to change to keep in touch with changing ground realities. It cannot be something that you made 50 years ago will be applicable 50 years hence. So much would have changed in between. So definitely, if a policy requires to be changed, it can be changed and should be changed. If the factors on which the policy was based, if those factors change, then obviously the policy has to change too. It cannot be divorced of each other, then it would be unrealistic.
We began by talking about, you commented on how you were optimistic about a lot of indigenous work that was happening in general. Could you tell me a little bit about your opinion? Because there are many defense startups who are now coming up in India. We recently on this platform spoke to a very exciting rifle manufacturer, for instance, and there are many others doing all kinds of, processes and activities. Talk to me a little bit about what you find exciting in this ecosystem, this emerging startup ecosystem in defense manufacturing.
Well, now that this field has been opened up to one and all, whether you're a big industrial house or working from a two-room garage, now that this field has opened up, there is a lot of interest to get in here. Obviously, the startups are at the low end of that scale, of that equipment scale. They're more into small things like drones and rifles. Of course, bigger weapon systems will remain with the bigger industrial houses. But because of this opening up, there is a lot of enthusiasm generated in the industry to fill this void which was there. And when I was in the chair, when we had to do certain procurements of drones, the order went to Idea Forge, which is a startup, and they competed very successfully against very well established players to emerge the winners. So it is not that a startup cannot compete with well established players, and I think that one order which was given to them enthused the entire startup community and the MSMEs that we can also, and that it is indeed a level playing field, and those apprehensions that हम कहीं नहीं जा सकते, we will never succeed, were quite were allayed to a large extent. So more and more people should jump into the fray, but at the same time a word of caution that when we spoke about it, that the timelines are so complicated and extended, that you have to have that staying power. Because most startups with limited funding may not be able to sustain themselves for 10 years without an actual order coming into their order book. So at the same time, they have to also not only bank on the defense market, especially for things like, say, drones. Drones can be used in agriculture, it can be used in healthcare, it can be used for delivery, for delivery systems, or Amazon or something. So yes, look at that defense market, but also look where else you can export it, or who else you can give it to, so that your company remains functional and in the in the green or black, and that you don't fold only hoping that this defense and the lucrative bulk defense order comes through. So they have to look in more than one direction.
I have two last questions for you, sir. One of my questions is that one of the concerns that many people have is that India had a very long and hallowed tradition of getting extremely fine young officer cadets who would come from very perhaps almost illustrious households, many of them, who would, and over many generations, association with the Indian Armed Forces, who would then go on to become officers. Now, over time, some people believe that while India still gets a lot of, Jawan, soldiers wanting to join the armed forces, and very good quality soldiers, at the officer level, the kind of people who were joining the armed forces, the numbers have begun to shrink. And this is a problem. How do you see this?
Well, with changing socio-economic conditions in the country, obviously it affects the army also. You made a distinction between the Jawans and the officer class. In the Jawans, of course, there is no dearth of recruits. But I think that is equally true for the officers. For every one vacancy at the NDA, there are more than 20,000 applications. And that is the kind of ratio that is. But definitely, the intake has become much more broad-based. If 50, 40 years ago, the people who were aspiring to join the army as armed forces as officers, if they came from defense backgrounds or more influential families, the base has increased. So now they're coming from all over the country and from different walks of life. So the cadet joining the NDA could be a general's son, it could be a farmer's son. And once you join, there is no difference between the two. And that is actually one of the aspects I've mentioned in the book. Because the two officers, the two main protagonists in the book, are from these two diverse backgrounds. And they do equally well. And there is no difference between the two.
My last question goes back to where you began, sir. You said that at one point, India's armed forces, because they had a colonial legacy, were encouraged to keep a distance between them and the so-called civilian population. But as part of India's democratic milieu, 75 years after independence, the armed forces guards the people of the country. And the more the people of the country know the armed forces, develop a respect, admiration, and indeed affection for people who choose the way of life of the armed forces, including many who offer the ultimate sacrifice, there is a deeper bond. Therefore, I want to conclude this wonderful conversation, and thank you very much for your time, by asking you about the process of decolonization within the Indian Armed Forces. There's been decolonization in many aspects, in academia, in government, in many other aspects. What about decolonization within the armed forces? How has that panned out and perhaps is still panning out?
I think there is no grand plan as such of decolonization. It is something which is happening automatically as part of as we grow and organization also matures. And the changes which are happening, everything should not be seen under the lens of decolonization, or it should not be given that color, or we should not just make changes for the sake that this was started in colonial time, so we need to change it. If changes has to be brought in, and whatever change, and I again get back to that point which I made earlier, is it going to make you more operationally efficient? If yes, please change. If no, it doesn't matter. Is it going to make you more efficient by speaking to the troops in their language, or is it going to be more efficient to speak to them in English? The answer is very clear. Obviously, the troops will understand it much better if you speak to them in Hindi or in Punjabi rather than in English. So obviously you have to speak to them in their language. But it is not because of decolonization. It is because it is an operational necessity. So there is no scope of misinterpretation or ambiguity and things like that. But just for the sake of change, we should not be making changes or give it that anti-colonial flavor for everything. Otherwise, there is no end to it. If that be the case, the whole IS should be disbanded. Started
I
with
know,
the British.
I know many people, sir, who would be delighted at the thought of that,
So
and
we
of course,
should,
many
as I
people
said,
who
no,
wouldn't like it also.
we should not
But
take to ludicrous levels. That
yeah,
logic doesn't work
no, I
after a
understand.
certain point of time.
I understand.
So we should, as I said, change has to be for becoming more efficient.
That's right. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation, General Manoj Naravane, former Chief of Army Staff, Indian Army. This is his book. The general has chosen in his retirement to write a wonderful fiction, a thriller based on the NDA, based on NDA cadets and their experiences. I won't give the plot out, but it's a very interesting thriller. Thank you very much, General, for your time. Please buy the book, read the book. It's a great, thrilling novel, and I'm sure this is only the beginning of a whole new career as a thriller writer, General. Thanks very much for your time indeed.
Thank you, Hindol. It was a pleasure talking to you, and let's stay in touch.
With great pleasure, sir. Thank you very much.